So the Canadians sent word, we need help. And Rickover assigned Carter to take a team of 24 on a highly classified mission to Chalk River, Ontario, to help them. On a tennis court near the reactor, they mocked up sort of a approximation of the valves and pipes in the reactor. And then they had a very early video camera, which they put in the reactor, and it transmitted to the tennis court so that everything that was done when they were practicing on the tennis court, they could see was also done in the reactor when these teams of 3 would go in for 90 seconds and complete their mission.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelly Lesher. Today I'm speaking with Jonathan Alter, who is an author, a political analyst, a documentary filmmaker, and all-around great guy to speak with. He has written 3 New York Times bestsellers. 2 were about Barack Obama and 1 about FDR. Keeping with the presidential theme, in 2020 he released the book His Very Best, Jimmy Carter, A Life. This might seem like an odd choice for a nuclear podcast, but Carter was in the nuclear Navy when it was in its infancy, and this experience shaped many of the policies he pursued while in the White House. Read or listen to it. However you consume content, get this book. It will change not only how you view politics today, but also answer the question that might be kind of niggling in the back of your head. What if a logical person who uses facts to solve problems was in charge of a country? My first question for you is, why did you want to write about Jimmy Carter? Like, what was the interest behind writing about him and talking to him in the first place?
Well, I had not covered Carter. I was too young to have covered his presidency. I had been an intern in his White House in the summer of 1978 in the speechwriting office. And then through the years that I was writing a column in Newsweek, I didn't really pay all that much attention to him. I interviewed him once on a Habitat for Humanity site in New York in 2000. And then I was talking to my editor about possible books, and she was Jimmy Carter's editor. And she pointed out that nobody had actually written a biography of Jimmy Carter. And right around that time, he came to a book club that I'm in, and he talked about his experiences at Camp David in 1978, bringing peace between Israel and Egypt, which was a huge deal. The Camp David Accords, basically. They didn't bring a comprehensive peace and a settlement of the Palestinian issue, but they prevented another major war between Egypt and Israel, which had fought 4 wars in the previous 30 years. So it was a very big deal, and I was impressed by Carter's description of his role at Camp David. And I started to think, anybody who could pull off this sort of virtuoso performance, there has to be more to him than the easy shorthand, crappy president, great ex-president, which anybody that you talk to is going to say, right? That's the cliche. And I just started to realize that can't possibly be the whole story. And with the encouragement of my editor, who helped smooth the way and give me a tremendous amount of access, both to Carter and his wife, Rosalind, and to their whole family, I started out in 2015, and then I spent basically close to 5 years on and off writing the book.
Well, thank you, because that is the narrative that, of course, I had heard, not growing up during his time as president, kind of crappy one-term president. But your book gave me a completely different look at Carter as a scientist, a very deep appreciation for what he did in office. And I'd always wondered, what would a scientist look like as a president? And I think I now know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's probably the closest that we're going to get, if not a scientist, an engineer as president. Herbert Hoover was also an engineer, and he also got wiped out when he ran for a second term, and his accomplishments as president have been almost completely forgotten. They resembled one another temperamentally. They shared the frustrations of engineers who sometimes have a hard time understanding why the rest of the world can't react with the same degree of rationality that they do. And Carter, who was prone to exaggeration sometimes when he was running for office, occasionally would call himself a nuclear physicist, which is not really accurate, even though he worked on one of the most exciting nuclear programs ever, which we'll get to. But if he wasn't a nuclear physicist and he didn't have a PhD in physics, which is probably necessary to call yourself a physicist, he was undoubtedly a nuclear engineer and approached problem solving the way an engineer or a scientist would.
I think that came through in the book. And with the background, I think he could have safely called himself a nuclear engineer and not have gotten dinged for that.
No, he didn't get dinged for that. It was only when he called himself a nuclear physicist that he got dinged by PhDs and people saying, well, that's not really right, because his training was at the Naval Academy, and then at Union College he took some advanced physics classes, and then he was very involved in developing one of the prototypes for the first nuclear submarine, which required him to master the nuclear physics involved in the establishment of a nuclear submarine.
Let's go back to that. Why did Carter join the Navy? Because when he joined, they wouldn't have had a nuclear program.
No, I mean, they didn't have a nuclear program even when he graduated from the Naval Academy. Carter had an uncle who was in the Navy when he was a little kid, and he would send him scrimshaw and other mementos from his travels around the world. And he was Carter's favorite uncle, his mother's brother. That fired Carter's imagination when he was a kid growing up outside of Plains, Georgia. He didn't even live in Plains, population 650. He lived in Archery on a farm just outside of Plains. And nobody in his family had gone to college. But this idea of joining the Navy got into his head, and his father, who was a successful merchant and farmer, tried to get him appointed to the Naval Academy, which requires a congressman to do that, in the early 40s. And the congressman said, well, you have to go and get more education. So he went to Georgia Southwestern State College at that point, and then he went to Georgia Tech, a very fine school, for a little more training. And then he went to the Naval Academy and graduated in 1946. And after he was in the Navy for 5 years and doing pretty well, he was an officer, he applied for what was the most elite program in the Navy, which was run by a legendary figure named Admiral Hyman Rickover, who was one of the most important military and scientific figures in the history of the United States. And I urge people who don't know much about him to read more about Rickover. I have quite a bit about him in my book, but you'd need to go to a biography of him to really get the full story. And Rickover decided after World War II that he would try to put a nuclear power plant on a submarine. And he succeeded in doing so. The first nuclear power plant was on a ship, a boat, 2 years before it was on land, generating power. And this program, which Rickover almost single-handedly developed was the most exciting technological project of the middle part of the 20th century, akin only to the space program and later the development of the internet. This was just an enormously exciting area. And the result, which was nuclear powered submarines and nuclear powered aircraft carriers, by the account of many people, including Colin Powell, won the Cold War because the Russians could never match it. And we had the ability with these nuclear submarines to change the strategic balance because they could go out for a very long time without having to go back to port and go deep beneath the ocean. And when the Russians tried to match it, they had all kinds of safety problems and accidents, which Rickover, because of his intense focus on safety and the brilliance of the team he put together, never had to experience. Carter helped when there was an accident in a Canadian experimental reactor, but Rickover's program never experienced any problems. It was very elite, very hard to get into, and Rickover was a huge jerk personally. Nowadays, he would never get away with the way he intimidated people, both in the job interview and then when they went to work for him. He would last about 2 seconds in today's military and 1 second in today's workplace.
How early on in the program did Carter get involved?
Rickover in the late 40s got a joint appointment at the Atomic Energy Commission. And so basically he developed his program by sending memos to himself. So he'd put on his admiral's hat and he'd send a memo asking for permissions from the Atomic Energy Commission. Then he'd put on his Atomic Energy Commission hat and send a memo to the Navy asking for permission. And through force of will, he developed this program. And the first prototype was called the Nautilus. And Carter did not work on that. And that was, I believe, it was launched in 1950 and it was deployed in 1954. Carter joined with Rickover only for a little less than a year, as it turned out. He worked on the second prototype, which was called the Seawolf. And the first prototype was called and is called a light water reactor. This became the industry standard, and basically all of the military's reactors, whether on land or sea, are light water reactors, and most commercial nuclear power plants are light water reactors. But there was a different technology that used liquid sodium that they were trying to develop in the late 1940s and early 50s. And the one that Carter worked on, which ended up not being adopted, was a liquid sodium reactor aboard the Seawolf. But it was all part of the experimentation process. So Rickover was cold and humorless and very, very hard to work for. But Carter learned from him to give everything he had to whatever he happened to be doing at the time. And the reason that my biography is called His Very Best is that in 1952, when Carter interviewed to get into Rickover's program, the interview, as I mentioned, was very, very difficult. And Rickover would quiz Carter on all kinds of different things, from literature to music to anything that Carter brought up in the interview. And he even shortened the front legs of the chair so that the interviewee would be sliding out of the chair during the interview. And then he didn't do this to Carter, but to other people. He would say, go open the window. And when it was nailed shut, he wanted to see how they reacted. Or he would say, piss me off, and say something to piss me off. So one guy swept everything off of Rickover's desk. He got in. Another guy, when Rickover told him, call your girlfriend and break off your relationship or you can't get into the program, when the guy picked up the phone to do it, he threw him out of his office because he didn't want anybody stupid enough to do that in his program. So these were a series of very challenging things that he would say. Carter kind of got off easy, but at the end of the interview, after Carter, when he said he liked classical music, Rickover said, what kind? And when he identified some of it, he said, all right, well, what's your favorite music from these classical composers? What's your favorite movement? And when Carter couldn't answer the questions as well as he thought, he started to feel like he wasn't doing very well and wouldn't get in. And then Rickover said at the end, where did you stand in your class at the Naval Academy? And Carter said, I stood 59th in a class of 820. And Carter thought that was pretty good. He thought that would help him. And Rickover just stared at him. He said, did you do your best? And Carter thought for a minute and he said, well, I guess I didn't always do my best. And Rickover said, why not your best? And he swiveled around in the chair. The interview was over. Carter's just sitting there. Rickover's no longer paying any attention to him. He gets up and leaves. He calls his wife and tells her he thinks he hasn't gotten in. And actually, because he answered honestly, Rickover let him into the program. And I argue in my book from that day in 1952 until today, when Carter is 97 years old, he's done everything all in. He's done his very best, whether he's fly fishing or trying to prevent a war or whatever he happens to be doing, he gives his very best. And that really comes from Rickover.
You can see that in just the intensity of everything he does.
He's an enormously intense guy. I asked one of his sons, Jeff, sum up your father in one word, and that's the word he used, intense. Now, you don't get that impression when you see Jimmy Carter with that smile. And, there's video of him with a cardigan sweater talking to the country about energy. He's not a very good television performer. He had terrible inflation that he couldn't cope with, sky-high interest rates. He's crushed by Ronald Reagan. And so we don't think of him this way, but it is actually the way he was and is. And even amid that unpopularity, he got a tremendous amount done as president.
And a tremendous amount of really important things done. It wasn't just trivial things that didn't matter. It was stuff that we're still benefiting from.
Right. Like clean energy, for instance. I mean, he had the first federal support for clean energy. In the area of energy and the environment, where he signed 15 major pieces of legislation, doubled the size of the National Park Service, with the millions of acres added in Alaska and in other parts of the United States, developing really the first coherent energy policy that this country's ever had. Very, very important expansions of the authority of the Environmental Protection Agency, which are about to be undercut by a Supreme Court decision. But the list goes on.
I hadn't realized that he started the Superfund either.
Yes, Superfund cleanup. That was just a few months before he left office. That bill was passed.
Which has had a huge impact.
Yeah.
So I want to go back to his year in the nuclear Navy. I can't believe it was only about a year that he worked with Rickover. One of the things I saw was actually trending on Twitter not that long ago was the work that he did at Chalk River. So what was Chalk River and how was Carter involved?
The Chalk River experimental reactor, about 100 miles from Ottawa, was the site of the first accident of the nuclear age. Remember, this is 7 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There are no nuclear power plants yet, but there are experiments going on mostly in the United States This was one in Canada. And in 1952, basically something went terribly wrong at the Chalk River Laboratories. It was a classified facility, and for many years, the details were classified. I have the most detailed account. It's only 3 or 4 pages in my book that's ever been published. So I was actually a little bit surprised when it was trending earlier this year as if it was a new thing since I'd written about it in my book. But in any event, through human error, the sheathing around the 25 fuel rods that were in this experimental reactor ruptured and the fuel rods started to melt. And so, as I think your listeners know, basically as a result of that, there were these hydrogen gas explosions that happened when a meltdown. And they were so powerful that they blew the 4-ton seal off the reactor through the air and straight into the ceiling. And they found that 10,000 curies of fissionable material went all through the facility. I think they estimated there was 1 million gallons of radioactive water all over the floor of the reactor building, the basement of the reactor building. And it was 3 feet deep, and they were really worried, and understandably worried, that it was going to flow into the Ottawa River, which was very close by. Now, you have to remember, at this time, nobody had any experience with this kind of thing at all. The safety protocols that Rickover was trying to implement had not been adopted worldwide. And so the Canadian officials are, very, very concerned. Nobody was killed, but they were very, very concerned about what was going to happen. Among the things they were worried about was that the uranium would be oxidized and that would cause a huge fire, or that the hydrogen would come into contact with irradiated water, which would then also, another way that you could have a huge explosion. The engineers in Canada were really scared about this and trying to figure out what to do. And they realized that they couldn't send their people into the core of this experimental reactor without killing them, because you could only go in. They estimated that nobody could go in for longer than 90 seconds. At that time, they estimated that if you went in for 90 seconds, your exposure would be equal to a year of radiation, and they were off by a factor of 1,000. It was much worse than that, but turned out that when they studied it later, everybody, including Jimmy Carter, survived their 90 seconds of exposure. So the Canadians sent word, we need help. And Rickover assigned Carter to take a team of 24 on a highly classified mission to Chalk River, Ontario, to help them. On a tennis court near the reactor, they mocked up sort of a approximation of the valves and pipes in the reactor. And then they had a very early video camera, which they put in the reactor, and it transmitted to the tennis court so that everything that was done when they were practicing on the tennis court, they could see was also done in the reactor when these teams of 3 would go in for 90 seconds and complete their mission. They set all this up, and Carter broke his team into 8 groups of 3, and so they had 8 missions under him. And they went in and turned the valves and removed the flanges, whatever they were doing, as part of trying to prevent this water from flowing. Then afterward, they were told, they kind of joked about, would this make them sterile? What would this do to them? Would it shorten their lives? But they were young men. Carter at that point had 3 sons, but 15 years later, his wife had Amy Carter, who I think some people remember, who was a child when he was in the White House. So he clearly was not made sterile by his exposure to the radiation. And when they studied it later, they found out that most people were fine. And basically they couldn't draw any connection between exposure at Chalk River and shortened lifespans of the people who were there in the aftermath. So the reactor was eventually reopened after the cleanup. One of the lessons it left for Carter was don't respond to nuclear fear mongering. And this became important when the 3 Mile Island accident happened when Carter was president. And Carter went to 3 Mile Island, went inside a control room and met with the officials there. But Carter drew a distinction in his mind, a very hard and fast distinction between uranium reactors and plutonium reactors. And this, to me, acting on this was the best of Jimmy Carter, because when he was president, there was a plutonium reactor called the Clinch River Breeder Reactor in Tennessee, Clinch River, Tennessee. And it was one of the most expensive and ambitious projects in the federal government. And Carter killed it. And he knew that he would not carry Tennessee in the 1980 election because, needless to say, that reactor brought a lot of jobs to Tennessee and it was popular. But he believed, based on his own research and the advice of people like Admiral Rickover and other experts, that plutonium was just too dangerous. And we don't have plutonium reactors in the United States.
So there's a couple questions in there, but we'll start with that because it was in 1977, I believe, that he kind of ended that breeder program, but he also ended plutonium reprocessing.
Right. Too dangerous.
And we still deal with that. I mean, other countries reprocess their fuel, and we still can't because of Carter from 1977.
Right. I mean, we reprocess the uranium, but not the plutonium, is my understanding.
Yeah. And so you think that's a direct result from what he saw in Chalk River and then in 3 Mile Island?
I don't think it's a direct result of Chalk River. I think Chalk River, the result of that was that he wasn't anti-nuke, right? So even though the 3 Mile Island experience basically ended the construction of nuclear power plants in the United States, that wasn't because Jimmy Carter wanted that to happen. That's just because, the 3 Mile Island accident, even though it wasn't nearly as serious as people feared at the time, basically spooked the country on nuclear power, and the permissions and everything that are required just became too onerous. The government in the early 50s, right around the time Carter was in the nuclear Navy, they passed a piece of legislation that immunized the nuclear industry from lawsuits. And basically, the federal government insured the nuclear industry. And a lot of those guarantees that helped the industry flourish in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were chipped away at, and it just became prohibitively expensive and time-consuming to build a nuclear power plant. And we're now paying for that, because it is a good way of combating climate change. But what impressed me about Carter was the thoughtfulness with which he approached these issues. And he just drew this distinction between uranium reactors and plutonium reactors. And from my very limited understanding of this, that makes a lot of sense, that tiny amounts of plutonium are extraordinarily dangerous.
There wasn't much in your book about 3 Mile Island.
I didn't go into detail about it.
Was there just a lot going on at the time for Carter? He responded quite well to it, but do you think he put the country at ease at that time with his visit?
No, I don't think he did. I don't think his visit accomplished that. So much of American politics is about what was later called, what we now call optics. That word wasn't used, but there was a tremendous amount going on that year, the Iranian Revolution. It was before the hostages were seized, but the economy was in terrible, terrible shape. And he's dealing with having to put back together the Camp David Accords. He had signed the SALT II agreement with Premier Brezhnev. So he had a lot on his plate. But I think his political shortcomings were beginning to become apparent. And it's not like he didn't devote enough time to it. It's that he was in a position where it was really hard to combat fears. So you might remember this movie called The China Syndrome with Jane Fonda and Jack Lemmon. That movie came out shortly before 3 Mile Island.
I mean, it was like weeks, right?
Just a few weeks before. And there was not a lot that Carter could do to calm people's fears. It wasn't until there was an actual report about 3 Mile Island that we really knew that it wasn't all that serious. But that would be months, really years before we knew that. So at the time, the other thing that was going on then that I found very interesting, especially in light of COVID, is that Carter, among his other accomplishments, established FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration. And in the days after 3 Mile Island, he made sure that the federal government and the state and local authorities were properly prepared for evacuations and other kinds of things that might be necessary. So the disaster planning, and Carter had a history as a land use planner when he was in Georgia. The planning was excellent. And it made me think, if Jimmy Carter had been president when COVID happened, the response would have been much better coordinated, and we would not have lost 1 million lives. I can say that quite confidently.
So the last thing I wanted to touch on was the only issue I believe that was specifically mentioned in Carter's inaugural address, which was arms control.
Yeah.
And you mentioned earlier that he signed SALT II with Brezhnev in 1979, but it was never ratified. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is this one of his regrets as president?
Yes. What happened is that when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in late 1979, early 1980, basically Christmas time, that prevented the ratification of SALT II. But interestingly, the provisions of SALT II were respected by both the United States and the Soviet Union, and they offered a good predicate for the START treaty that Reagan finally began negotiating. So they were an important interim step in arms control, and he was intensely interested in the issue. But even there, the optics were not good. So at the end in Vienna, after he signed the SALT II treaty, Brezhnev leans in for a kiss, which they do, as you know, in Europe and Russia. Carter, wanting to be polite, does it. One of his State Department officials, who I talked to about it afterward, was sitting just a few feet away, said he knew immediately that this was going to be a problem for Carter, that he's photographed kissing the Soviet premier.
Why is that a problem? I mean, Trump was best friends with Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, but we live in a post-Cold War, well, we might have a new Cold War, which is a different situation, but the fear of communism as such is not nearly what it was in the 1980s. And at that time, in the late 70s and early 80s, you had part of the Republican Party and even some conservative Democrats who considered themselves neoconservatives. And these folks were extremely critical of arms control and of Carter reaching out to the Soviet Union.
What was SALT II? Like, what was in the treaty? Why was it so important?
So, strategic arms limitation talks, and they had started under Nixon and Ford, and they were the first time that the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to limit the development of nuclear weapons. They really didn't start reducing the stockpiles until later, but it was the first time since the nuclear test ban treaty in the Kennedy administration that there was any progress towards arms control. So first they banned above ground testing in 1962, and then the United States and the Soviet Union in 1975, I believe was the year of SALT I, first began that process of arms control. And, now it's not in fashion to talk about any of this. And both sides have about 1,500 nuclear weapons, which is enough to destroy the world many times over. And both sides have been modernizing their weapons. And we now have China to worry about and North Korea. The reason that I think SALT has some enduring importance is even though it was pretty weak tea in terms of really addressing the problem, it started the process. And so diplomats in later years could get back on that track that Carter helped advance. I think the real tragedy of Jimmy Carter not getting a second term is in the area of climate change, because just weeks before he left office, his White House, through something called the Council on Environmental Quality, issued a report that made recommendations about this problem that nobody outside the scientific community had ever heard of, called global warming, carbon pollution. And the recommendations in that report to Carter were precisely what the Paris Climate Accord of 2015 agreed to. And this was in 1980. And so with all of the previous reports that he got through this initiative that was called Global 2000, every one of them led to proposed legislation. So even though Carter in the energy sector is partly remembered for having shifted and been a partisan of coal, and the reason is because coal was domestic and Carter's first objective was energy independence, and he actually set us on a path to what is now close to energy independence. So that came first, and he certainly wouldn't have moved aggressively against fossil fuel, but he would have clearly been on top of it, and he was the first leader anywhere in the world to recognize that global warming was a problem. And he had other proposals like moving to electric cars by the middle of the 1980s that suggested that he knew that we had to get off of fossil fuel because A, we were importing it, and B, it was dangerous in its own terms.
Do you think that was his plan to include more nuclear energy in the U.S., even though it was on the decline?
I don't think that he had thought about that at that point, because they were still dealing with the after effects of 3 Mile Island, and he had Rickover issue a report about it. He wanted Rickover to think about it. He definitely was resisting efforts to kill nuclear power, but it was not the time to talk about expanding nuclear power because nobody wanted to hear that at that point.
Yeah, the country didn't have an appetite for it.
There was no appetite. So whether he would have undertaken efforts a couple of years later, if he'd been reelected to convince the country that we needed to move in this direction, I don't know. The takeaway is to have a kind of a nuanced view of nuclear power the way Jimmy Carter did, to respond to the evidence and not be sort of sidetracked by either politics, fear-mongering, or boosterism. And I think that one of the lessons of Jimmy Carter is that you can bring some level of empiricism to government. And we have other examples of it. Michael Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, he didn't do anything without data. So we do have some people who approach their responsibilities that way, and it's something that we should be wanting to encourage in our politics.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed that conversation, there is more to it in our bonus content, which covers Jimmy Carter's environmental policy and his human rights work. Visit our website at mynuclearlife.com for information on how to gain access via Patreon. Thank you to Jonathan Adler, and thanks to you, our loyal listeners. Please tell your friends about our show and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen. Until next time, I'm Shelly Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.